Please note that the information shared in this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only. Nothing discussed should be interpreted as specific legal advice or as creating an attorney-client relationship. If you have questions about your organization or situation, we encourage you to connect with your own local counsel. Welcome back to Let's Talk Solutions. I'm your host, Hunter Pettis. Last season, we began an important conversation about a topic that continues to impact everyone on a daily basis, and that's cybersecurity. We talked about the importance of vulnerability, awareness, and recognizing that even smaller organizations can become targets. One of the things we emphasize is that cybersecurity is not a one-time conversation. Threats evolve, and today, as a result, we'll continue to have that conversation. Today's we have the opportunity of having two guests on the show who bring equally valuable vantage points. We're going to talk about scamming prevention, how churches and schools can protect and store sensitive information, and practical ways to build a more robust communication system for your ministry. That being said, allow me to introduce today's guests. First, we have Gary Sewell, serves as AVP of Information Technology and Audiovisual at Southern Adventist University, where he oversees the technology and communication systems. Gary's world centers around protecting sensitive personal and academic data while also keeping a community connected and informed, something that I'm sure translates directly to churches and even elementary schools. We also are joined by Ken Brodie, a former senior civilian executive for the Department of the Air Force, where he served as Deputy Director for Information Technology and Chief Information Security Officer at the Pentagon. With over 40 years of experience, Ken has led enterprise-wide cybersecurity, information protection, and risk management across high-value mission environments in the country. He's also represented the Air Force on national cybersecurity policy bodies, including the Federal CISO Council and the Committee on National Security Systems. Gary and Ken, welcome to Let's Talk Solutions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Hunter.
Last season, we had the opportunity of having a conversation with different guests related to cybersecurity in our episode titled Protecting Your Digital Identity. We had the ability to lay a little bit of the groundwork, but that's been a few months ago. And I know that the landscape is constantly changing in cybersecurity at a rate that sometimes we feel we can't always keep up. But I think it's great to have both of you on the show because it allows us to catch up and also to catch up our audience on the latest in cybersecurity and how they can further protect their vulnerabilities. So as I kind of break the ice, I'd like to ask the first question to Ken. In cybersecurity, I do know that there's often talk of hardening targets versus soft ones, and you've had the opportunity to spend decades protecting some of the most sensitive national security systems in the country. Now, from your vantage point, what have you learned about human and even systemic vulnerabilities that apply across the board?
Yes, thank you, Hunter. So let's say from a systemic perspective, vulnerabilities exist in systems. We know that technical vulnerabilities, software needs to be patched. So the technical vulnerabilities, that's something that the average or typical person in a church or a school or even at home would not really engage in other than having antivirus software on their computer. That's about the extent of it from a user perspective. But when you start talking about some of the trending and scamming and some of the other nefarious behavior by bad actors, you really have to think about awareness. Awareness is key at the user level. Understanding, what a threat what an exploited threat looks like. What do you do when it happens? But again, it really comes down to user awareness, because at the national level, when you start talking about enterprise systems and critical national security systems, there's a whole conglomerate of resources and agencies targeting that particular landscape. So you're not going to have the robust security hardware and software and and tactics and techniques. You're not going to have that at the local level. So again, I think it really comes down to awareness. And a scam is a scam is a scam. It doesn't matter whose the target is. It's still, they're going to use the same type of phishing and social engineering techniques to get a target to click something that they're not supposed to click. So I would say for the most part, it's really about user awareness and understanding. Every time you sit in front of that computer, you need to treat it as if you're going to be attacked while you're sitting in front of that computer, and your behavior should dictate that.
Yeah, I believe that definitely makes a lot of sense. I know that, for all of us, especially kind of on our day-to-day basis, some of the vulnerabilities that we always consider is our personal information or maybe our financial or banking information. So it's something that we definitely have to keep an eye out for. And I know with our local churches, it may be a little bit difficult to consider, hey, maybe we don't have that much information. Maybe things aren't um, it doesn't always seem like we're at that big of a risk compared to maybe big businesses or the government or things like that when it comes to cybersecurity. Gary, I'm also interested from your perspective, since you work in higher education there at Southern. What are some of the things that maybe you've seen some and how it's changed in the threat landscape and some of the different vulnerabilities on the educational side of things?
Yeah, so we're seeing a lot more targeted attacks. So it used to be when you built a website, you put as much information in there as possible. Lots of contact information, lots of, these are the people within the organization, and so it really kind of makes it super easy for those that are trying to be trying to do targeted attacks. So they can find that I'm the CIO, and they want to they think I have elevated credentials, and so we're seeing a lot of that, specifically like credential stuffing. So that is where there's a list of passwords that somebody has purchased, and they're going to just keep trying until they find out what your password is. But also MFA fatigue. So multi-factor authentication, what happens is when they find your password, they're going to keep trying to log in as you, and you're going to keep getting these MFA requests for you to approve. And after a while, you're like, all right, just I'll approve it. And then you're letting them in. So we're seeing a lot of those things that are specific to that, and targeting things like, for instance, just before Christmas, during finals week, Canvas, a learning management system, was hit, and that affected hundreds of thousands of people. Southern doesn't use Canvas, but it certainly affected a lot of our other universities. So it's very targeted towards a specific application, a specific thing, because they can steal a lot of credentials because it's online and lots of universities use it.
Yeah. You said something interesting, Gary, that it's almost easy to find out somehow, do a quick search, whether it's Google or LinkedIn or something like that, what somebody's role is in their, whether it's in their job or their organization. And they can see, hey, you are the CISO at Southern Adventist University. Is there an opportunity for me to exploit? Is there a vulnerability that exists? Can I essentially pretend to be Gary and attack? I'm sure you both and our audience listening have heard a lot about AI recently, and how the ability to use AI as a new tool. It's reshaping both how we move offensively, but also defensively when it comes to cybersecurity. And I would imagine that it has a significant impact on today's threat landscape. I'm not the professional, so I don't know for sure, but I'll go back to Ken on this one and ask, you know, why should these changes in the AI, the utilization of an AI tool, why should it matter, or does it matter for Adventist institutions?
In a general perspective, think of AI as, again, I can't speak for what specifically happens at the university level. My colleague can certainly do that for us. But what I will say is that when it comes to AI and cybersecurity, what we need to understand, we as end users down at the user level, need to understand that now AI brings a much more enhanced and highly capable additional capabilities to the bad actors. So just think of the bad actors having a tool set. They've got all these tools they can use to target and exploit. Now, with the powerful computing power of AI and quantum computing, where things run a lot faster at light speed, the the bad actors are now really equipped to make some really significant attacks, if you will, smart attacks like deep fakes, faking impersonation, voice impressions, and social engineering, and that we've never realized before when you start talking about things like uh, identity theft. So they have all of these tools available to them now at a much, much more enhanced capability. So the users, we need to be extra vigilant because now these things look real. They look so real, it's hard to not treat them as being real. So again, due diligence comes into play. Verify, verify. Don't click anything. Verify, 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 verify. But the good news is that as these hackers have these AI tools now, powerful AI tools to attack and to exploit. On the other side, on the defensive side, well, we have the same kind of AI capabilities to defend against AI-based attacks. So what you have is the cat and mouse game continues, right? It's just now at a different, higher technology level. Now AI versus AI technology has risen there. So at the core, the users just need to understand that they can do nothing about AI on their own. They just have to stay vigilant to the attacks that are nefarious or anomalous behavior that they're seeing on their computer or on their networks, and let the AI folks and the technical IT folks deal with the constant battle, offensive, defensive, now AI based.
Yeah. There's a few things in there that you had mentioned, especially when it comes to the deep fakes and how the bad actors utilize AI technology to exploit that from the average user. But I'm going to come back to that a little bit later in our conversation, just to kind of pinpoint what it is that these bad actors are truly using and exploiting for the average user to gain access to their sensitive information. Gary, just working at ARM, that we've had several data breaches at our universities, even some, I believe it would be referred to as ransomware incidents. What is it about universities that makes them so attractive to cyber criminals?
Well, to begin with, we have lots of data. So we have lots of students, we have lots of prospective students, we have lots of parents, we have lots of alumni, we have lots of supporters, we have just a plethora of data. And those types of things. We have financial information, so they're filing their FAFSA and they're trying to get financial aid, and we have records on that. We're also mandated to have health records for our students, so we have this pot of information that is very much wanted by many of the hackers. And so what we try to do is, and a lot of times we have open networks, right? Because we have lots of visitors, we have lots of parents here over the weekend, and we have students that have lots and lots of devices. It used to be that a student showed up with a computer, and now they have a computer, they have a watch, they have an iPhone, they have an iPad, they have a game station, they have so now there's 8 devices per student versus one, and so our networks have to be larger, and a lot of times they're open because there's a lot of trust. There's a lot of trust in the Adventist organization, right? And who would want to hack our Adventist institutions? Well, I can tell you who. And so a lot of those reasons are, and the same is true for churches. we just kind of trust. We have open networks because we need that for people who want to use it on Sabbath and during the week. And we instill a lot of trust, and we have a lot of data. Not that we should keep all that data and have all that data, but in the university setting, we're mandated to have that data. So the health records and the other things. So that's where we become a big target.
Yeah, I understand that. It's interesting. I think across the board that there's a lot of organizations. Big data is big business nowadays. Whether you're talking about universities, insurance companies, even in sports, you can see that a lot of them are using analytics in their data to, you know, I think in most cases they're using it for good. This also opens up Pandora's box for an opportunity for their source information to easily be utilized for bad as well. I'm interested, Gary. Has we're talking about what exists from a data perspective and how much is out there, but have you seen any progress? I guess to protect your campuses better. Uh,
Yeah, definitely. We've done a lot of things over the last couple of years. So we meet every month and kind of go over the landscape of what we have. But some of the things like multi-factor authentication has been a large one. And there's a lot of universities that have said, well, we don't want to put multi-factor authentication on the student accounts because it's going to be cumbersome for them to get into, and they may have to do that several times a day. Well, I can honestly tell you, great. I'm cool with that. And I'm not I don't really care when it comes to whether or not I'm creating a bit of an issue for a student in this regard, because it's a protection. It's a protection for them and the university. So we have gone to the extent of not only we first implemented multi-factor authentication for our staff, and that was great. And we saw a reduction in the number of compromised accounts. And then we went to students and we saw a big reduction. But then we had this large amount of accounts for our alumni. Now, alumni some alumni use their accounts, some don't. So there are accounts that have been stale out there for years and years and years. So we've done things like we've scrambled passwords. So if you haven't gotten into your account in the last year or so, we make it so that you have to change your password. But we also put multi-factor authentication on it, and it has reduced the number of our compromises greatly and has been very helpful. So we've tried to do things like that, but also education is the biggest thing. I mean, in fact, we're higher education, right? So we should be doing that anyways, but it's a constant reminder. I go to meetings, I give a reminder in a meeting, hey, let's make sure this is a new scam that's coming out, educate people so they understand it, and just raise awareness, constant awareness. It's not going away ever. We can never let our guard down.
what I'm hearing you say is that it's important for organizations to have that need for sound security practices. I think more and more organizations are definitely implementing that. I think at a I don't want to call it basic, but it's probably one of the first line defenses is changing your password or making your password more complicated, not using the same password over and over. We talked about that in our previous episode on cybersecurity, not to use LNG White or some other reference directly to the Seventh Day Adventist Church as the code to get into the church when you're talking about physical security, but also cybersecurity as well. I'm sure that there's some churches out there, hopefully not, but use LNG White as their password or something like that. So ultimately, it's every individual has a role because you're talking about alumni, you're talking about those who are currently working at the school. It's a community effort.
There's a couple more things. Don't share your credentials. Make sure that only the people who need access to the systems are the ones that have the access. So I may be the associate VP of IT, I don't have any privileges. I don't want any privileges. I'm a target. Don't give me access to financial data. Don't give me that stuff. I don't need it. And people should have the least privilege possible.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with you. I hope for our listeners, they're digesting a lot of this information and becoming a little bit more vigilant and aware of the things that they may overlook. Because just as much as we try to play defense, like we've mentioned, the scammers are also becoming increasingly skilled at exploiting people's emotions. They know how to create urgency, and they also know how to create fear. And so I want to bring it back to Ken on this next question. So, from a national security and threat intelligence perspective, we kind of talked about it earlier in the conversation when we were talking about AI and how the utilization of deepfakes and such. But what are some emotional triggers that scammers rely on to bypass, for lack of better words, people's critical thinking? Why is it so easy for us to fall for these things?
The adversaries is what we used to call them. Their whole job is to prey on emotions like fear, like you said, urgency, authority. So we like to talk about the things that the role or the goals of a scammer or a hacker. First, they want to pretend to be some entity that they're not. Secondly, they want to pose a problem to the target. Thirdly, they want to apply pressure to the user to solve that problem. And again, quickly back to the pressure, the urgency. And then finally, they want to ask the user to pay to resolve the matter. So when you start talking about the average user picking up a phone call or getting an email that emphasizes fear if you don't do it, you got to do it now. There's an authority behind it. It may have an IRS emblem on it or something. There's a curiosity. A lot of times it's just pure curiosity. Click here for $1,000. A lot of times it's plain curiosity. Sometimes it's excitement. There's a show coming to town. Free tickets are available here. And then there's greed. Okay, win money. Greed. So there's a lot of things that bad actors play on. And the reason why I think the church needs to understand is that the church, as Gary said earlier, we're faith-based people, so we tend to love each other and to trust each other. And bad actors know that, and they play on that for sure. So they would want to understand that the trait that the spiritual person has, if you will, are the very traits that attract bad actors, because they know that our nature, if you will, is to trust. And so I go back to my theme here today is awareness, 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 and doing what you can do at your level. Because when we start talking about systems and technical controls and those types of things, they're kind of out of the sphere of the average user. So I always like to work security from the bottom up. What does the person sitting in front of the keyboard need to know about these things? And I kind of leave the implementation of technical and administrative and operational security controls, leave that to the experts. But when you start talking about what bad actors do, just to give you an example, every country has their cybersecurity offensive and defensive capabilities. Every country has that. Well, when you have the state of the country backing an organization that's dedicated to hacking, that's a powerful entity. And those are state level attacks, right? Government attacking government. It happens every day, all the time. So at that level, that's the national level. The national level is to protect the critical infrastructure, water, power, petroleum, all of that. But again, down at the church and school board, school and even your home, the attack is to get people to open up their personal information. They're after personal information. So at one point, it's state-driven, government trying to disrupt government, the other government, if you will. And then at the user level, local level, if you will, they're trying to get personal information. So I think that the key is to develop awareness programs, The key is to make sure you create infographics or visual aids, continually putting them out there. Got to make people smart, and that's where it comes into play. And I would say that every church should develop a cybersecurity awareness plan. Should develop one. Again, even if it's just a lot of visual aids around, but like Gary says, when he's in meetings, he speaks to it. But you can't pound security awareness training and education. You can't emphasize that enough, because at the end of the day, that is all the average user has as a weapon, as in defense. So
Yeah, that fear and urgency piece of the puzzle. I know it's not quite proper English, but I've almost got a few times. You prime example. You've recently ordered a package, and now you're getting a text message that says, "Hey, UPS tried to deliver your package," and you're thinking about it, something that you actually recently purchased, but in actuality, this is not. It has nothing to do with it, and it's just an opportunity to exploit what's going on or try to gather some of your information.
yeah.
Um,
And to add on to that, Hunter, when you put the AI based attack in that same scenario, then it becomes much more realistic, and so you just compounded the ability for not only for the bad actors to succeed, but for the targeted person to click where they shouldn't click, where they're using their emotions instead of logically thinking things through and not verifying.
One of the things that I find fascinating, there's a show. It no longer comes on, but it's mostly reruns now. There was a show called American Greed. I find it fascinating just as somebody who works in risk management, because a lot of times on that show, it's somebody who's concocted up a Ponzi scheme most of the time. But it's a lot of times it's weaponizing trust is probably the best way that I could put it, where there's still that fear, there's that urgency. A lot of times, because it's American greed, it has to do with money. There's an excitement factor to it where, oh, maybe I do have an opportunity to win $1,000 if I respond to this a random text message that I just received or something like that. It's always fascinating to me how many organizations think they're safe until someone finds an opportunity, a kind of a hole in the wall, if you will. So I want to kind of again come bring back to the higher education side of things. On a college campus, I actually am pretty interested. Earlier you were saying, Gary, that there's a lot of student information, family information, medical information, and I could imagine that most of it, some of those exploits may have to do with financial aid or tuition or maybe even enrollment related scams. Are any of have you seen any tactics like that? Does that exist?
We see them all. We see them all. They're coming at us from all angles, trying to, they target financial aid, you know, try to send in various things, create this urgency. And it's really, the education for our staff and everybody on what it is that they do. It used to be that before AI, you could always tell because it was, things were misspelled and it didn't flow. But now it's this super nice formatted, you know, uh, proper English message that comes through, and it's so believable. Just this morning, I was working with somebody on their conference. Their treasurer had their account compromised, and they sent out a SharePoint document to a bunch of other conferences. And it seemed real, but it wasn't. But on our campus, definitely we see that. We also see where a student would get their account compromised, and then they're coming in under that account and sending out emails trying to get a bunch of information from that. So, it's whenever we have any kind of a compromise, any kind of a threat that comes through, we sit down and we try and figure out, and it's a constant thing, right? You get a compromise, you get some threat, and you try to determine, all right, the next time this comes through, how do we mitigate this particular piece? And it's this constant. re-engineering of how to do that. And for those organizations that don't do that and just say, oh, we had a compromise, let's take care of that, you're doing yourself a disservice. And the church needs to be the same way. Any kind of a threat, let's say we get like the whole thing with the gift card, that's an old scam. It's
Hmm.
still going on. People are still falling for it. And that's where we have to really help people understand, take away all the emotion, take away all the urgency. As Ken said, verify, verify, verify. Get on the phone, call that person who is trying to do that. All the, any of the FAFSA stuff, any request that we get through email, we're not just going to change a password. We're not just going to update any of that stuff. We're going to verify. We're going to call that parent. We're going to call that staff member. We're going to call the president and say, hey, is this what you wanted us to do? No, I
Hmm.
didn't think so. And so we're not going to do it. And
Yeah.
we need to be okay questioning each other as to whether or not that was our true intention.
Yeah. I mean, that's hitting the nail on the head, as you both mentioned, verify, verify. So picking up the phone, confirming whether or not is this really from Gary Sewell? Is this really from Kenneth Brodie? Did you send this information, or or is this fraudulent at this point? I know from we were talking about the financial aid scams and things of that nature, but it also happens at our local churches. Sometimes it may be face to face, but I think that there's also an opportunity where bad actors may utilize or take advantage of different seasons, whether it's during the holidays or giving seasons where we're trying to collect some funds for different projects. Yeah.
It's interesting because they say that if you have a security awareness training program, if you only do it like once a year, it's as if you've never done it before. and
Mm.
and so it has to be on a more regular basis. So once again, we say that it's not one and done. It's not one conversation and we're done. It's a constant reminder. And churches honestly should, I mean, we nominate everybody, right? We nominate for the nominating committee. We should nominate somebody for cybersecurity
That's a
and
great point. That's a great point, Gary.
of our church. I mean, the impact of these things on our church are it's huge, and we should all take it seriously, whether or not you're a small church or a large church. Either way, the impact can destroy the church.
And
That's a
that's
great point. And if I could add, Hunter, maybe that's something that ARM could look at, right? I mean, potentially, because having somebody that's on boots on the ground at the church that's that's been designated as the cybersecurity point of contact, if you will. That person is responsible for the church's awareness training and education program. Maybe it is something that can be elevated because we live in a digital world now. Again, all the other officers are appointed, and maybe it's time to really look at that position being in on the church board, if you will, as a risk mitigation individual, which would fall, I mean, maybe that's something that ARM can look at as far as, hey, cyber has become so essential, and information is so much information out there. We don't even know half of the sensitive information we have. Case in point, a lot of times, on several occasions during my government time, sensitive information was stolen, but the owner of that information wasn't treating it as sensitive. That happens. So I think first and foremost, a lot of times you have to identify all your sensitive information. Right now, and I don't think anybody at the church level is doing it. That would be one of the things that your cybersecurity person would do because you have to identify it and then protect it. So if you don't know you have it, then it's unprotected. Very, very important point here as far as putting the roles on somebody to oversee cybersecurity at the local church. I think it's critical.
You both said two things that really stood out in my mind, and one being the fact that there's varying sizes, as we all know, of churches in the out there in the Adventist community. Some are large; we have more than enough people to somebody to be the risk manager, somebody's the pastor, someone's the head deacon, someone's our cybersecurity professional. In some instances, whether that's at a church, individual church, or a smaller school, it's one person wearing five hats. That being the case, they may not always be the most tech savvy person. They may be the person that knows how to use PowerPoint the best or Excel the best, but that doesn't mean that they are a true professional. And one thing that you all have reiterated a few times throughout this conversation is that sometimes it's the solution is pretty logical if we take a simple and logical. And so, what I would like to do is kind of take some of the things that you all have already mentioned. This question is for both of you, but for the less tech savvy person, what are two or three simple habits that can make the biggest difference and the biggest impact, maybe even in their starting point for developing their cyber program?
I'll take a first stab. I think one of the major things is that people need to have strong passwords and not use the same password across the board. That is going to get them in big trouble. And they tend to use the same for their work and for the church and for them personally, which brings all three of those entities into risk. And so I think if they can maybe utilize a password manager, something of that sort, that can be helpful for that. And the other thing is that, a lot of times everything is an IT issue a lot of times, right? It's an IT issue. But the reality is that these folks are the first line of defense. They're the ones that are really on the forefront of everything. And education is big. Nobody's asking for everybody to turn into a cybersecurity professional. I have a master's degree in it. I still am learning every single day, and I plan to continue doing that. And it's just a matter of getting more familiar with it, kind of understanding and educating not only themselves, but helping others to understand that. Like, I talk to my in-laws all the time. My mother-in-law, she gets a text on her phone that said she ordered an iPhone and it's being delivered, and she just cannot get it through her head that she didn't order an iPhone. And she's like, I need to let them know I didn't. They know you didn't order an iPhone. But then
Right.
why did they send me a text? They know because they want you to respond. Take away the emotion.
Yeah.
So
That was really good, Gary. I'm interested in your take. What are some two or three things that a church could start to make a habit to build their program?
I kind of like what you said before, and I want to talk about that just for a second before I actually dive into the question. When you said that churches come in different sizes and flavors, so you may have a church with very few members where one person is wearing several hats. How do they get into the cybersecurity awareness, and how do they actually make sure that cybersecurity due diligence is happening at their church with a handful of folks? I think that's a great question and a significant challenge. What I will say though is it's that important. The protection of that information and cybersecurity is that important where, you know, I would recommend that churches reach out to cybersecurity consultants. It's not as daunting financially as you would think. In a lot of cases, there's a lot of discounts out there with Microsoft Office 365 and Google Spaces that actually offer discounts for nonprofits. I would say if the expertise isn't locally available at your church, then you need to look at maybe partnering with another church, getting some cybersecurity, some IT consultant under your belt, and let them guide you through what needs to be done. Because it can't you can't afford to not have it done. So for the smaller churches, again, I would partner up. Maybe there's members in the church that know somebody that can come and help them with that are cybersecurity professionals that can come and help them. But again, it's too big of a load for a small church. And so, but again, you can't do without it. So I would highly recommend that first and foremost, where you can outsource your IT and cybersecurity to a cloud service provider. I wholeheartedly recommend it. So that takes all of that off of the church. The only thing the church needs to understand is make sure that they have a solid service level agreement with the service provider. And again, the consultant can help them with that. But this is too big for the local churches, especially the smaller ones. They just can't do it. And if they can't do it, they're not going to do it, and they can't afford not to do it. So that investment is critical. Back to your original question, the password issue is just a national problem. And so much of a national problem where there's been a recent executive order signed by the president that is aimed at strengthening AI and cybersecurity within the government. And one of the things that is being discussed is passwordless systems. You're going to see that over the next, in the near future, I think, where no longer are you going to be creating passwords with X number of characters, X number of special characters, numbers, letters, uppercase, lowercase. All of that's going to go out the window because they're going to be passwordless systems where the actual access would be a phrase or maybe a sentence that's unique to the individual. That's much more difficult to crack, especially with AI, with these high speed password crackers that can crack a password in seconds nowadays. So now the passwordless systems become in play. So users are going to have to get used to knowing their passphrase. That could be a sentence or two or however long they want to make it. That's much more secure than a password of fixed length and fixed structure. So I think you're going to see that coming. I think it's a big thing to do for the government, especially with the AI-based tools, again, that can crack passwords in seconds. So absolutely leverage cybersecurity consulting in your church, big, large, medium, small, leverage cybersecurity consulting. And the cloud service providers, they want to help the nonprofits because guess what? When one organization, nonprofit or not, when one organization fails cybersecurity, there's a breach. It's a breach for the entire country. That's the way the government looks at it. So again, reach out for that consulting and develop strong cyber awareness programs.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. I want to ask. I hope this is not too much of a curveball question, but it makes me. Well, actually, even before that, I like the fact that you brought up passphrases because it's not mandatory, but we internally here at ARM we're supposed to change our password. I think it's every 60, 90 days, somewhere in there. But if you make a passphrase, the it stays valid a lot longer. So I currently also use a passphrase. It's not the most exciting thing when I have to put my password in multiple times per day, but at least I believe that my information is a lot safer as a effect of it. But the question that I wanted to ask, and is mainly because I imagine many of our listeners, as you all know, I imagine both of you have been with the Adventist church for a while now, and you know that there are some positions in the church that are um, you're an actual paid employee of the church, and sometimes you're a volunteer. And a lot of times people move, people go to different churches, and so what I would imagine, I don't know if this is the proper term or not, but I'm considering maybe like a leftover user. So someone who they had access to the system and then they left the church. They went somewhere else. Is there any vulnerabilities that exist with that? Because I know that that's something that's pretty common, even from the working space where someone goes from Atlantic Union Conference to California and but they still know the information and logins from their previous locations.
That is certainly an issue. The other thing about it is a lot of times we consider, hackers to be the only threat that we actually have. It's an actual threat if an individual leaves a church, goes to another church, and then still is able to log in and find information for the other church, that's a threat. And we need to consider that as well as and handle that as almost a hack. I mean, that is not appropriate. And so we need to be at the university as soon as an individual leaves that day, their their credentials need to be and their privileges need to be revoked, and their access, not only digital access but physical access as well. And we need to start protecting the physical assets. So at Southern, we have over 1,200 acres. We have a lot of stuff, and we can't afford for somebody, whether or not they're disgruntled or not, they should not be able to get back into a building. They should not be able to get into a system. Those things should be, and we need to be diligent about managing those, whether you're a small church or a large church. That's just the way it is. And there should be no, like, we can sit and argue about it all day long, but it must be done. I think Ken would agree with me.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. In fact, what you described, and I'm glad you did, was what we term as the insider threat, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
so the government has a whole organization, the National Insider Threat Depart- Department. There's a whole organization dedicated to mitigating risk associated with the insider threat. A whole national organization. That to give you an idea how big the problem is. But at the church level, again, it goes back to that checklist and rules of engagement, or whatever you want to call it, policy. Part of that overall comprehensive church and cybersecurity policy should include how personnel security is done. So when somebody leaves the church, all their credentials on that local network are revoked. And that's part of again, putting together that local cybersecurity plan at the church, where when somebody leaves, one of the first things that happens is their access is removed from the network and their information is removed from the network. There's no way they can reach back because, again, one of the biggest threats is the insider threat. So guarding against that is critical. I'm glad Gary brought it up. Again, but it comes down to churches just having that cybersecurity plan and executing the plan. And it's not just once time a month or whatever. It's daily. It's daily. That's why it's important to have one and consult with someone that knows how to do it and conduct it. Because cybersecurity is a 24-hour a day job, 365 days a year. It never stops, never stops. And no church has the resources to cope with that.
I think as an organization too, we're lacking in policies and procedures. Like, we need to have those. I think we're afraid to have a policy and a procedure, and we're also afraid to have some teeth behind it. Like, if you don't follow this policy or this procedure, and you put the Adventist church or your church in risk, there needs to be something that says, "Hey, this is inappropriate," and there needs to be some kind of a consequence for it. And I know that's, wow, people are going to be like, "Whoa, this is more than what we can handle." But it's really not. It's what we need.
Yeah, you bring up a good point, Gary. And actually, hopefully I'll ask this question properly because I know that many churches rely on a myriad of tools to communicate, and some may leave them a little bit more vulnerable than others. So, as an example, you may use an email list, you may use group text, whether that's through your local provider or WhatsApp. You use social media to communicate. You may even have some shared drives. And so, again, this is for both of you. Is there anything, or I guess, what should a church or a school look for in different softwares and platforms, whether they're encrypted or not? Are you more likely or more susceptible to divulge information if you're using text to send certain things versus a secured email address? So what should a church or a school look for in software and platforms when it comes to communicating and also storing that information from a security perspective?
Well, I will tell you, Hunter, I'm a big proponent of cloud services. So, I mean, especially for official communications and collaboration of sensitive information, uh, how's the saying go for the last 5, 6 years? Take it to the cloud. Take it to the cloud. The cloud is secure. The cloud has your data insured. The cloud has your data encrypted. The cloud encrypts your communications. For a small subscription fee, storage is relatively cheap. And again, those discounts to nonprofits, we need to take advantage of those because this thing is just going to continue to escalate as in technology and the proliferation of information. It's going to be too much for churches. That's why we have cloud service providers. And the church needs to embrace that and allow someone else to that responsibility of protecting their information under a rock solid service level agreement and free up time for us to do the soul winning that we're supposed to be doing.
I agree with that, but there is still a certain amount of liability that our organization has, even though our data is in the cloud. But I think for a lot of these churches, I think what is important for them to do is maybe to reach out to their conference, union, even the North American division and the GC, because a lot of tools that they need are very similar to what many other churches are using. And the NAD may already have something for them to use. I think a lot of times we think like we're the only organization that does certain things and that we're different. And so we have to go out and, certain, people like Google or Office 365. And so they, we can't always be different. And so I think the NAD and some of the other organizations within the Adventist Church can help us to help solidify. And if there is a service provider that we use for that, then great. So we can gain awareness by that. So I absolutely agree, Ken. That's if you can put it in the cloud, it certainly helps because a lot of the infrastructure is super expensive, and for a small church to build that
Right.
and be able to upkeep it and do the patching and all the other stuff that the rest of us have to do on a weekly basis.
Mhm.
And trust me, my staff get tired of patching and patching and patching, but it is what it is.
Yeah, we used to call patching the whack-a-mole game. You
Yeah.
patch one, another one pops up over here. You patch that, another one pops up over here. So, and I'm glad you brought up a good point, Gary. And I want to emphasize the fact that you're absolutely correct. Even if you move your data to the cloud, the ultimate responsibility still falls with that information owner. However, the information owner can negotiate the protections that they want that data to be under in their service level agreements. So if the cloud, we like to say that the cloud service provider is responsible for security of the cloud. The information owner is responsible for the information in the cloud.
In the cloud.
So that's not something that we can dismiss. Well, I put it in the cloud, I'm done with it. No, you have to continue to make sure that the service provider has got the right security protections around that sensitive information. That information cannot be accessed only by people in your organization. So a lot of controls you have to put in place in the service level agreement. That's why the consulting with the cybersecurity person helps with that. But thank you for bringing that out, Gary, that we're not done with the responsibility of the information.
Yeah, I I just want to say that I really appreciate this conversation. I think for our listeners, I hope that we're moving the needle in the right direction. You guys have given them a bird's eye view of the vulnerabilities that exist at higher education, at the church level, anywhere in any organization. Some of the things to look out for, how bad actors are utilizing different tools to weaponize trust, to get them to divulge sensitive information. But you also have had the opportunity to share with our listeners some of the tools and resources that exist when it comes to helping them, like the cloud, not computing, but the cloud, utilizing cloud systems and softwares to be able to better protect the utilization of passphrases as opposed to your simple password. And so I think these are all good steps in the right direction. And so I want to say that this is yet again a very important conversation. I appreciate the differences yet complementary expertise that both of you have brought to the table. As we kind of put a bow on it, if there were just one thing that you could tell our listeners, if you haven't started already, if you don't have some type of program in place, or even an individual at your local church who's already serving as the cybersecurity professional, what is that one thing that they could do today, right now, to get the ball rolling?
I would say that first and foremost, it's hard to just narrow it down to one thing. It's definitely hard to narrow it down to one thing. But for the sake of placing the sensitive information at the protection of the sensitive information as the priority, I would say organizations need to go back and identify all of their sensitive information. Because again, that becomes a problem in itself if you don't know what you have. If you don't know what you have, then you can't protect it properly. So I would say go and identify your sensitive information, centrally store it, or and have it encrypted. But again, the protection of the sensitive information, it starts there. It starts there. So identify it, know what it is, know where it is, and know how it's protected.
I would have to say, I mean, Ken, that's absolutely essential. I would say, as a starting point for anybody, manage your password appropriately. Change it to a phrase. Get it longer. Let it become something that is there are websites you can go to test your password. Now, as a as a cybersecurity professional, I want you to know you should not put your actual password in there to test it. That wouldn't be appropriate. But you can test your password or a similar password to see how long it potentially could take to crack your password. But use a phrase. Get used to making it more difficult for somebody else. It doesn't have to be a phrase that you can't remember. Make it a phrase that you can remember, and make each one of your unfortunately, make every one of your accounts with a different password. And you can figure out how to do that. We're all pretty smart individuals, but do that, because if you start there, you can lower the risk and then start on other things. And if you're an organization, then have your users, your first line of defense, have them do that. And you may have to force them to, but I think that's a critical piece for the average user.
I'm glad you answered the question I didn't ask, Gary, which was, should I put my password in some of those websites? It immediately made me think, well, that's also could be another tool for bad actors to be out there to get access or to your password. But I appreciate that bit
Trust
of.
no one.
Well, I will say one of the biggest reminders from today's episode is that cybersecurity is an ongoing conversation, and one that I'm gratefully appreciative of today with both of you. I think that it's something that, with those conversations, it creates a bit of confidence, builds an opportunity for our church and church members to recognize the risk, to protect their sensitive information, and to continue to do what we are called to do, which is to serve others with care and wisdom. So verify, verify, verify. That's going to be the hashtag. So if you're coming across holiday seasons where there's generosity, where there's a lot of giving, we want our communities to be we do want them to be generous, but we also want you all to be informed. So, as I begin to kind of close up and wrap up this conversation, Gary, Ken, I definitely want to thank you both for being a part of this today's episode and providing as much education as you have for our listeners. So, thank you so much for being a part of that.
My pleasure, Hunter. It's been fun.
Definitely a great pleasure for me. And it was great to meet you, Ken.
Same here, Gary. Same here. Maybe we'll consult with each other.
Absolutely.
And that's what I'm glad you said that. So that's one other thing that I want to say. So as we are, we exist as a larger community. So if Ken or Gary, if you want to share how people can get in contact with you, because I know Gary, if you aren't already, as you know, we have many universities out there that could always use another person to bounce ideas off of. And Ken, there's plenty of churches, plenty of opportunity for your expertise out here in the Adventist church. So if you would like to share an email or anything like that for our listeners, feel free.
All right, well, it's kenbro28@gmail.com. That's KENBRO28@gmail.com.
Mine's Gary Sewell at southern.edu. So that's GARYSEWELL at southern, SOUTHERN.edu.
Again, thank you both, Ken and Gary. On that note, for our listeners, here's a challenge. Choose one action. Gary and Ken have given you plenty, but choose one action that you can take this week. Review your online habits, talk with your family members about scam awareness, verify before responding to any unsuspected requests, or at least take stock of where your church stores sensitive information and who has access to it. I encourage your congregation to start a conversation about the communication tools you rely on and whether they're actually secure. Thank you for joining us for our Let's Talk Solutions. You can find this episode and all episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music. You could also visit adventistrisk.org, navigate to the Let's Talk Solutions podcast under the Safety Resources tab. As always, remember, faith and preparation are not opposites, they're partners. Together, they help us honor God and navigate the risk of life with confidence. Until next time, stay faithful and stay prepared.